Episode 7. Thomas was never gone. Nell Harrow. David was heavier than I remembered. Not physically, necessarily. Structurally. The sort of man who, even half-conscious and dragged out of a supernatural administrative ambush, still managed to feel like a problem that ought to come with paperwork. Elise and I got him into the back of the car while Margaret Vale watched the house. Not stared at it. Watched. There's a difference. Staring is emotional. Watching is tactical. Margaret did everything tactically, including disapproval. David was awake, but only just. Pale, breathing shallowly. Coat damp at the shoulders, though he had not been wet when he went in. His right hand kept flexing as if it expected to be holding something. I noticed that and wished I hadn't. Elise got in beside him in the back. I took the driver's seat. Margaret opened the front passenger door, then stopped. "Not here," she said. I looked at her. "What? We do not assess him on this street. Why?" She gave me a look that suggested the answer should have been obvious to anyone with a functioning nervous system. "Because if the house can still see him, it can still count him." Fair enough. I started the engine. The whole terrace remained dark. No curtains moved. No neighbours came out to ask whether everything was all right, which in Britain is how you know things are absolutely not all right. As I pulled away, I checked the mirror. Mum's house sat in the row like a missing tooth someone had painted over. No light, no movement. Front door shut. But on the upstairs landing window, just for a second, I saw a shape pass behind the curtain. Small. Running. Then gone. I looked back to the road and said nothing. There are moments when reporting what you've seen is useful. There are others when it only gives fear a better coat. "Hotel," Margaret said. Elise looked up sharply. "No." Margaret turned in her seat. "Yes." "He can't come there." "He absolutely can. There are guests." "Then let's all pray your guests remain more manageable than the dead." Elise glared at the back of her head. I said, "Is the hotel safe?" Margaret considered that with irritating calm. "No place is safe, but your hotel is familiar to the threshold, and familiarity is sometimes enough to stop a place being rewritten quickly." Elise muttered. "That is not reassuring." "No," Margaret said. "It is useful." That was as close to comfort as she got. I drove. Peterborough at night again. Roundabouts. Retail units. Sodium light on wet roads. A kebab shop still open. A lad smoking outside a betting place. The ordinary world carrying on with its usual lack of respect for private catastrophe. In the back, David shifted and made a low sound through his teeth. Elise leaned over him. "David." His eyes opened. Not fully. Enough. He looked at her first, not me. That made sense. She was nearest. Also, perhaps because the house had just tried to marry them on paper, and the universe had apparently decided subtlety was for other families. He said hoarsely, "That was unpleasant." Elise stared at him, then, despite everything, said, "Bit of an understatement." He shut his eyes again. "Fair." That helped more than it should have. I said, "Are you with us?" His eyes opened again, this time finding me in the mirror. "Yes." "You sure?" "No," he said, "but I'm answering anyway." Also helpful. Margaret twisted in her seat. "Mr. Harrow, do you know your full name?" He looked offended. "Yes." "Say it." He did. David James Harrow. "Date of birth?" He gave it. "Current address?" He gave that too, with increasing irritation. Elise said, "Are we doing witness protection now?" Margaret ignored her. "Last question. When you were married, what did Eleanor keep in the kitchen drawer to the left of the cooker?" I glanced at her. That seemed unfairly specific. David frowned, then said, "Rubber bands, takeaway menus, batteries that may or may not have worked, and a screwdriver for no clear reason." I looked at the mirror again. That was correct. Margaret nodded once. "Good." David said, "Would someone now like to explain why I'm being interviewed like a concussed estate agent?" "No," I said. He gave the faintest ghost of a smile. "Still David, then? Or enough of him to make losing him later a proper problem?" We reached the hotel in 12 minutes. Too long? Not because anything happened. Because nothing did. Nothing is underrated as a form of dread. Elise's hotel sat in its usual place off the road, trying hard to look more respectable than the budget and the carpets allowed. Brick frontage, modest sign, 2 cars in the side bays, reception lights on, curtains drawn in the lounge. Ordinary. Thank God for ordinary. Until I saw the revolving door. The hotel did not have a revolving door. I slowed, then blinked, and there was the normal entrance again. Single glass door, brass handle, potted plant dying by the mat. I stopped the car. No one spoke. Margaret said very quietly, "Good, it's trying." Elise looked at her. "Trying what?" "Premises testing." I put the car in park. I hate that phrase. "Yes," Margaret said. "Keep hating it." We got David inside through the side entrance instead of reception. Not because we were hiding him from staff, because none of us wanted to risk the front threshold if the place was already being looked at. Elise led us down the service corridor past the laundry cupboard and the little office where she kept invoices, rota sheets, and emergency biscuits. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The carpet smelled faintly of bleach and old radiator heat. I could have kissed the walls. Not because I loved the hotel, because it was ugly in a human way. "That matters." She took us into the small breakfast room at the back, shut the door, and locked it. David sat heavily in one of the dining chairs and put both hands flat on the table as if checking it was real. Margaret stayed standing. Of course she did. I leaned against the counter and watched him. He looked exhausted now. Not ghost pale. Human pale. The sort of pale people get after shock, bad news, or one too many fluorescent corridors. Elise put the kettle on. That, more than anything else, made the room feel salvageable. Margaret said, "Before anyone asks, no, tea does not fix this." Elise didn't turn round. "No, but it stops me murdering you while you explain it." Margaret accepted that. David rubbed a hand over his face, then stopped halfway and looked at his fingers. I saw it before he did. Ink. Dark blue-black along the side of his hand and thumb, as if he'd brushed wet writing. Elise saw it too. "Oh no." David stared at it. "I didn't touch anything." Margaret crossed the room in 3 steps. "Show me." He held out his hand. She didn't touch it, just looked. Then she swore. Properly this time. I said, "What is it?" "Transfer ink." The room went still. David looked up. "I'm sorry, what?" Margaret straightened. "It means you touched record even if you didn't touch paper." I didn't. "No," she said. "But something touched you." That was worse. Elise turned off the kettle before it boiled over. "Can we have one sentence tonight that doesn't sound like it belongs in a Victorian asylum?" "No," David said, still looking at his hand. "Apparently not." I pushed off the counter. "What does it mean in practice?" Margaret answered immediately. "It means the house marked him as having handled active correction." David looked at me. "I would like to formally object to that phrasing." "Noted," I said. He gave me a tired look. "Is that meant to be funny?" "No?" "Good." Elise brought mugs over anyway. Tea for me, tea for David, tea for herself. Nothing for Margaret, who looked like she subsisted entirely on nicotine and historical resentment. David took the mug in his clean hand, then frowned. "Why is there salt on the rim?" Elise said. "Because I'm improvising." Margaret said, "Good girl." Elise looked at her. "Don't call me that." "Also fair." I sat opposite David. Up close, he looked older than he had an hour ago. Not dramatically, just enough to notice, as if the house had made him use muscles he hadn't known were there. I said, "Tell me exactly what happened after the line went dead." Margaret opened her mouth. David beat her to it. "No." I blinked. "What?" He looked at me steadily. "No." That was new. Not refusal for the sake of control. Refusal because he had made a decision. Margaret watched him with sudden interest. David went on. "Not until she tells me the truth." He looked at Margaret. Not angry, not loud, worse, precise. "What happened the first time?" Silence. Elise frowned. "The first time what?" David didn't look at her. The first transfer failure. The room changed. Not supernaturally, socially. Margaret's face closed by degrees. I said, "How do you know that phrase?" David lifted his ink-marked hand a fraction. "I heard more than you think." Margaret said, "You were in contact." "Yes," he said. "And unlike some people in this room, I listened when the dead woman started explaining the filing system." I nearly objected to the tone, then decided he'd earned it. Elise sat down slowly. "What first transfer failure?" No one answered quickly enough. David did not take his eyes off Margaret. "She said there was a child." That landed like a dropped plate. Elise looked at me. I looked at Margaret. Margaret looked, for the first time since I'd met her, like a woman who would rather be anywhere else. David continued. "She said the line was supposed to split cleanly after the child died." No one moved. No one breathed properly. He went on, voice quiet now. "But it didn't." Elise said, "What child?" Margaret shut her eyes once. When she opened them, there was no point pretending anymore. "Your mother had a brother," she said. Everything in me went cold. "What?" Margaret looked at me then, and there was no comfort in her face because comfort was not one of her skills. "Before you. Before Elise. A boy." Elise stared. "No." Margaret nodded once. "Yes." I said, "Mum never said—" "No," Margaret said. "She wouldn't." David's hand remained flat on the table, ink drying into the lines of his skin. He said, "Helen called him the failed transfer." Margaret flinched. That told me more than any explanation could have. Elise whispered, "That's not a child. That's a report." Margaret's voice was very quiet now. "That is how Helen would have written him." I stood up so fast the chair legs scraped. "What boy?" Margaret looked at the table, then at me, then finally said, "His name was Thomas." And from somewhere above us in the hotel, not loud, not theatrical, just one floor up and directly over the breakfast room, came the sound of a child running. Nobody in the room moved. That's the thing about certain sounds. You don't react because you're frightened. You react because your body has already understood before your mind has caught up, and for one clean second it sees no advantage in making itself more visible. The running overhead stopped. One pass only. Light feet over old boards. Then silence. Elise looked at the ceiling, then at Margaret, then back at the ceiling, as if the answer might have been written there in nicotine stains and bad plaster. I said, "You're going to explain all of it." Margaret did not argue. That was how I knew it was bad. She pulled out a chair and sat for the first time that night. Not gracefully, not theatrically, just like a woman who had run out of standing room in her own history. Elise said, "Thomas." Margaret nodded once. "Yes." "How old?" Margaret looked at her mugless hands. 7. That number altered the air. Not because it was especially poetic, because it was old enough to be a person and young enough to make every silence around him feel deliberate. I said, "How did he die?" Margaret looked at me, then at David, then back to me. "In the house." Of course he had. I laughed once without humour. "Anywhere more specific, or are we still doing family legend by instalment?" Margaret accepted that too. "In the room behind the wall." No one spoke. The breakfast room seemed suddenly too bright, too small, too clean in the wrong places. Elise said, "There was no room behind the wall when we were children." Margaret gave her a tired look. "There was no room you were allowed to know about." That shut her up. David sat very still. I could see him filing every word away despite himself. Underwriter's brain. Pattern, liability, sequence. If he lived through this, he was going to be unbearable. I said, "Start at the beginning." Margaret rubbed once at the bridge of her nose. "The line had already become unstable by the time your mother was grown. Too much witness in one branch, too much threshold in another, too many corrections made quietly to avoid notice. Helen believed the only proper solution was a clean transfer through a child." Elise stared at her. "A child?" Margaret nodded. Yes. David said very flatly, I'm beginning to dislike the phrase proper solution. No one's asking you to enjoy it, Margaret said. Fair, I said. What does transfer through a child mean? Margaret's mouth tightened. It means a child before identity settles can sometimes carry role more cleanly than an adult already shaped by marriage, grief, profession, or refusal. I looked at her. You mean easier to use? She met my eyes. Yes. At least she had the decency not to dress it up. Elise said, Mum had a son and nobody thought to mention that. Margaret's face changed then. Not much. Enough. Your mother mentioned him every day for the rest of her life. That stopped Elise cold, Margaret went on. Not to you, not by name, but in the way she checked doors, in the way she counted stairs, in the way she never let either of you sleep in a room with a mirror facing the bed, in the way she kept the sitting room locked and the house half-packed as if departure might still save someone. I looked away, because that was true, because I could suddenly see half my childhood rearranging itself around an absence I had mistaken for temperament. Elise said quieter now, What happened to him? Margaret took a breath. Thomas was born after a difficult winter. The house was already active by then. Not loudly, not theatrically, administrative pressure, knocks, misplaced objects, names appearing in the wrong ledger. Helen believed the room had become ready. David muttered, That is one of the worst sentences I've ever heard. No one disagreed, Margaret continued. Your mother did not want him involved. I said, Good. Yes, Margaret said. Good. Sensible. Human. Unfortunately, not decisive. There was that old bitterness again. Not at us. At the machinery. At the fact that decency and usefulness so rarely overlap. Eliza tried to keep him ordinary, Margaret said. School, wellies, toy cars, jam on toast, the usual protections. Elise whispered. Protections. Margaret nodded. The ordinary matters. It gives children edges. I thought of the running overhead. Light feet. One pass. I said, And Helen? Margaret's expression hardened. Helen believed ordinary life was a delay tactic. She said the office had already marked him. Better to transfer cleanly than let the pressure build around the whole family. David looked at his tea. Efficient woman. Margaret's eyes flicked to him. Yes. Not praise, recognition. I said, So what did they do? Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone flatter, as if she were reading from something memorized long ago, because forgetting would have been more dangerous than pain. There was meant to be a controlled handover. One room prepared, one witness present, one threshold held, the child brought in, named correctly, then led out before the second knock. I stared at her. That is not a handover. That is a ritual. Yes, she said, a practical one. Elise made a sound of disgust. Margaret ignored it. Your mother agreed to the preparation, not the completion. That was the argument. She thought she could stand in the doorway, learn enough to protect him, then walk away. David said, And could she? Margaret looked at him. No. That sat there. Then I said, What went wrong? Margaret looked at me for a long time before answering. Your father came home early. I blinked. What? He wasn't meant to be there. Of course not. Men never are in these stories, until they are, and then the whole structure shifts because someone ordinary has walked into a room built on secrecy. Margaret continued. He heard Thomas crying. He forced the locked door. The room was already active. Helen tried to continue. Your mother tried to stop it. Your father tried to take the boy out physically. David's face tightened. That sounds reasonable. Yes, Margaret said. It was also fatal. Silence. Then Elise said, For who? Margaret looked at the table. For the transfer. I took a step toward her. No. She looked up. For Thomas, she said. That was the first moment the room truly broke. Not with shouting, with the absence of it. Elise sat perfectly still, one hand over her mouth. David looked down at the ink on his hand as if it had become someone else's. I stood there with nowhere useful to put my body. Margaret went on because stopping would have been mercy, and mercy was not on offer. The room opened wrong, not fully, not cleanly. Your father crossed under interruption. Your mother called Thomas by the wrong name, trying to get him back. I frowned. What do you mean, wrong name? Margaret shut her eyes once. She called him Tommy. I stared at her. That can't matter. It mattered there, Margaret said. Of course it did. Names, records, witness, threshold. Every stupid, brutal rule in this world built to punish human panic. Eliza reached for him, Margaret said. Your father pulled. Helen tried to complete the naming. The room corrected against all three of them at once. David said very quietly, And the child? Margaret answered in the same tone. Came back breathing. No one moved. No one breathed properly. Elise whispered, What? Margaret looked at her. He came back breathing. He lived until morning. That was somehow worse. Much worse. I said, What happened by morning? Margaret's face had gone old again. Not physically, structurally, like a building showing its cracks once the wallpaper gives up. He no longer answered to Thomas. The fluorescent light above us hummed. The kettle clicked as it cooled. Somewhere down the corridor a pipe knocked once. Ordinary sounds. All of them. Which only made the sentence worse. Elise said, No. Margaret nodded. Yes. David looked up at last. What does that mean? Margaret's voice dropped. It means he knew the house better than his mother. It means he asked for rooms that weren't there. It means he called Helen by a title no child should know. It means when your mother held him, he asked why she was standing in the witness position. I felt sick. Not metaphorically, literally. I sat down because my knees had finally decided to become involved. Elise said, Stop. Margaret didn't. He told his father the front door had been filed incorrectly. He asked where the second wife had gone. He said the room was still waiting. David shut his eyes. Jesus Christ. No, Margaret said again, with that same exhausted precision. Just a failed transfer. I said, What happened to him? Margaret looked at me. This time there was something like apology in her face. Not enough to help. Enough to wound. Your mother sat with him through the night. At 4:17 he looked at the wall of the locked room and said, That isn't where you left me. The room had become very quiet, not empty quiet. Listening, quiet, Margaret continued. At 4:19 he stopped breathing. No one spoke, not for a long time. Then Elise said in a voice I barely recognized, And you buried him. Margaret nodded. Yes. Where? Not in Peterborough. Why not? Margaret looked at her. Because your mother wanted at least one place the house could not count. That nearly finished me. Because it was so small, so human, so useless and so necessary at once. David opened his eyes. And after that? Margaret laughed once. A dreadful sound, dry as old paper. After that? After that everyone behaved exactly as families do after an impossible death. They lied, they edited, they survived badly. I said, And Helen? Margaret's face sharpened. Helen called it incomplete work. Of course she did. She wanted another attempt, Margaret said. Not immediately, later. With better preparation, cleaner record, less sentiment. Elise stood up so fast her chair hit the wall. She wanted another child. Margaret did not answer quickly enough. David did. That would be the implication, yes. Elise swore at a level that would have got her thrown out of her own breakfast room. I didn't stop her. Margaret said, Your mother refused, completely. After Thomas, she would not allow any child near the room again. Not by Helen. Not by anyone. I said, So she had us. Margaret looked at me. Yes. The words sat there, ugly and unfinished. I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Margaret held my gaze. It means you were not born as replacements. A beat, then. But you were born after refusal, not before it. I understood enough of that to hate it. Elise did too. That's not better. No, Margaret said. It isn't. The running overhead came again, this time slower. Not a child sprinting now. Measured steps crossing the room above us from one end to the other. 4 steps. Pause. 4 steps back. David looked up. Is that him? No one answered, because no one knew. Or because someone did and didn't want to say. I said, Is Thomas what's in the house? Margaret's face changed in a way I did not like at all. No, she said. That was immediate. Too immediate. I said, Then what is he? Margaret looked at the ceiling, then back at me. Thomas is the reason the house still thinks correction is possible. And directly above us, in the hotel room overhead, a child's voice said very clearly, That isn't my room. No one in the breakfast room moved after the voice, not because we were stunned, because movement implies a plan, and for one clean second none of us had one. That isn't my room, a child's voice, clear, mildly offended, not shrieking, not pleading, which somehow made it worse. Children in stories are often written badly, too eerie, too wise, too theatrical. Real children sound practical when they're upset. They complain, they object, they expect adults to fix the thing. That voice had expected correction. Elise was first to speak. No, not to us, to the ceiling, to the hotel, to the whole bloody shape of the night. Margaret stood up. Do not go upstairs, Elise turned on her. I manage this hotel. Yes, Margaret said, and tonight the hotel is being managed back. That was such an appalling sentence I nearly objected on style alone. Instead I said, If that's Thomas, it may not be. David looked up at the ceiling. It knew the room was wrong. Margaret glanced at him. Yes. He rubbed the inked side of his hand with his thumb as if he could erase it by irritation. That sounds less like a haunting and more like a complaint. No one corrected him because he was right. I said, What exactly is Thomas now? Margaret looked at me. I don't know. That's not good enough. No, she said, it isn't. But it's still true. The voice did not come again. Instead, there was a soft knock directly above us. 1, then 2, then 3, not from the corridor, from the room itself. As if a child upstairs had learned manners from the dead and was now applying them with professional discipline. Elise went pale. That's room 12. I looked at her. You know that how? Because this is the breakfast room and 12 sits directly above it. Fair. David said, Is anyone in 12? Elise's face changed. That told me enough before she answered. Yes. Margaret swore. Elise said, A couple from Nottingham. Checked in this afternoon, late 50s, coach holiday. He wanted extra pillows. David looked at me. That is the most British sentence anyone has ever said in a haunting. I said, Not helping? No, he said, probably not. Margaret was already moving to the door. Get them out. Elise followed at once, and I caught her arm. No. She looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. There are guests upstairs. Yes. And if this thing is using room logic, you charging into the corridor like an angry hotel manager may be exactly what it wants. She stared. That is, unfortunately, a fair point. No, but Margaret opened the breakfast room door a fraction and listened. The hotel beyond sounded normal. Distant television from the lounge, a pipe ticking, someone laughing outside in the car park. The sort of sounds that make you doubt yourself right up until the floor gives way. David stood up too quickly and had to catch the table edge. I was beside him before I could stop myself. You all right? He looked at my hand on his sleeve, then at me. No. Reasonable, but he didn't pull away. Also noted. Margaret looked back into the room. Corridor's clear, Elise said. I'm going. Margaret nodded once. Fine, but no one goes alone. I said, I'm coming. David said, so am I. 3 voices answered him at once. No. He looked offended. I'm the only one here who's just been inside the active site. Yes, I said. That is exactly why you're not coming. He opened his mouth. Margaret cut across him. Sit down, Mr. Harrow, before you become useful to the wrong side again. That did it. He sat, not because he liked being told, because he knew she was right. Elise grabbed the master key ring from the hook by the office hatch. The sound of keys in her hand did something ugly to the air. Not magically, symbolically. Threshold again. Access. Permission. Entry. Margaret noticed it too. No keys unless necessary. Elise stared at her. It's a hotel. Yes, Margaret said. And tonight that means it's vulnerable to administration. Keep the keys in your pocket until the door proves it belongs to you. I said, I hate that I understand what you mean. Good, she said. Keep hating it. We stepped out into the corridor. Fluorescent light, beige carpet, framed prints of local landmarks no one had ever loved. A housekeeping trolley parked badly near the linen cupboard. Ordinary, blessedly, insultingly ordinary. That lasted until we reached the stairs. The hotel had one staircase from the ground floor to the guest rooms, narrow carpet runner, brass rail polished by years of anxious hands and bored children. Tonight it looked longer than it should have. Not impossibly long, just enough to make the body hesitate. Margaret saw me notice. Don't count steps, she said. I wasn't. Good, don't start. We climbed. At the top landing, the corridor stretched left and right under low lights and cheap wallpaper. Room 12 sat halfway down on the left. Door shut. No noise, no running. No child. Elise whispered. I hate this more in hotels. Why? I said. Because in a house you can at least blame history. In a hotel it feels like customer service. That was so perfectly her, I nearly smiled. Margaret moved ahead of us, not touching the walls. Listen first. We did. Nothing. Then, from inside room 12, a man coughed. A normal cough, older smoker's chest, followed by the murmur of a television. Elise let out a breath. See? Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, listening harder. Then she said, Knock. Elise frowned. What? Knock, like staff, not family. That distinction made my skin crawl. Elise did it anyway. 3 polite taps, a pause, then movement inside, slippers on carpet, a latch. The door opened 2 inches on the chain. A man in his late 50s peered out, holiday polo shirt, reading glasses, entirely alive and annoyed at being disturbed. Yes? Elise switched into hotel voice so fast it was almost supernatural. Sorry to bother you, sir. Just checking everything's all right in here. He blinked. Yes. Why wouldn't it be? Elise smiled professionally. Report of a noise from below. He frowned. Only noise in here's the telly. And my wife snoring. From deeper in the room came a woman's voice. I'm not asleep. Then, after a beat, who's that? The man half turned. Hotel staff. And from inside the room, very clearly, a child's voice said, That's not where she stands. Everything in me went cold. The man in the doorway didn't react, didn't even blink, as if he hadn't heard it. Margaret stepped forward at once. Sir, I'm so sorry, but we've had a water issue in the room below. We need to move you. The man frowned. At this hour? Yes, Margaret said. Immediately. The wife's voice from inside. Frank, what's going on? Then she appeared behind him, dressing gown tied badly, hair in rollers, very much awake and very much real. No one's moving me, she said. Then she looked past us into the corridor and added, Who's the little boy? My stomach dropped because she could see him. Frank turned. What little boy? And there he was. At the far end of the corridor. Not translucent, not glowing, not cinematic. A boy of 7 in blue pajamas, bare feet, hair flattened on one side as if he'd been sleeping badly. Thin, pale, looking not at us but at the room numbers on the doors with mild administrative displeasure. Thomas. Or something wearing Thomas so well it made no difference at first glance. Elise made a sound in her throat. Margaret said very quietly, Do not use his name. The boy looked up. His face was ordinary. That was the worst part. Not monstrous, not damaged, just a child who should have been in bed somewhere safe in 1989. He looked at the woman in the doorway and said politely, "You're in the witness room." Frank laughed uncertainly. "Right. Well, that's enough of that." He started to close the door. The boy turned his head toward him, not fast, not threatening, and said, "No, stay where you were filed." Frank stopped moving. His hand remained on the door. His face went blank, not possessed. Paused. Margaret moved then, quick as a striking bird. She shoved the door hard, breaking the chain with a crack that made the woman scream. Frank stumbled backward into the room. Elise swore. I followed Margaret in because there was no point pretending I wouldn't. The room smelled of stale heating, cheap soap, and something older underneath. Dry paper. Dust from a place with no windows. The television was on, some quiz show, bright colours, laugh track. Entirely obscene under the circumstances. Frank stood in the middle of the room staring at the carpet. His wife had backed against the bed, clutching her dressing gown shut. "There was a boy," she said. "There was definitely a boy." Margaret pointed at Elise. "Get them out, now." Then to me. "Bathroom door." I crossed the room and opened it. Empty. Ordinary little ensuite. Towel rail. Plastic cups. Smell of bleach. No child. No hidden room. No wrong architecture. Behind me, Frank said in a strange, flat voice, "This isn't our room." His wife stared at him. "Frank?" He looked at the wallpaper as if seeing through it. "This is the witness room," he said. "The threshold room is smaller." Elise grabbed his arm. "Sir, I need you to come with me." He turned to her slowly, and for one dreadful second, his face looked exactly like David's had in the doorway of the house. Not possessed, not gone, just listening to instructions no one else could hear. Then the room telephone rang. All of us jumped. Not because phones are frightening, because timing is. Margaret said, "Do not answer that." Frank moved toward it. I got there first and pulled the cord from the wall. The ringing stopped. The television cut to static. And from the wardrobe behind, the wife came 3 soft knocks. She screamed properly then. Elise got hold of her and pulled her toward the door. "Out, both of you, now." Frank resisted, not violently, structurally, like a man who had suddenly become part of the furniture and saw no reason to leave. Margaret took the salt packet from her coat, ripped it open with her teeth, and threw a line across the carpet between Frank and the wardrobe. The effect was immediate. The wardrobe doors shuddered once from the inside. Frank blinked, then looked around as if waking from a dream. "What the hell?" "Excellent question," I said. "Move." That got him moving. Sometimes tone does what theology can't. We got the couple into the corridor. The wife was crying now. Frank looked furious in the way frightened men often do when anger feels more dignified. Elise switched back to hotel mode with admirable brutality. "I'm moving you downstairs, free of charge. Do not come back up here tonight. Do not answer any phone call to this room. Do not open the door if anyone knocks unless it's me." Frank stared at her. "Why?" Elise gave him the sort of look that could strip paint. "Because I'm the hotel manager and I said so." He nodded. Honestly, fair enough. She marched them down the corridor toward the stairs. I turned back to room 12. Margaret was still standing in the doorway looking in. The room had gone quiet again. Too quiet. I said, "Was that Thomas?" She didn't answer at once, and then, partly. I looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the boy is real enough to be used." That was not an answer. It was a wound dressed as one. I stepped into the room. The salt line still sat white on the carpet. The wardrobe doors were still. The unplugged phone lay on the bedside table like an insult. I said, "What's in there?" Margaret looked at the wardrobe. "Not a child." I went cold. Then, from behind us in the corridor, David's voice said, "He followed the room numbers." We both turned. He was standing at the far end of the hall. Of course he was. Pale, coat still on, ink still on his hand, looking exhausted and stubborn and exactly like a man who had ignored every instruction given to him in the last 20 minutes. I said, "What are you doing up here?" He looked at me, being useful to the wrong side, apparently. Then he lifted his marked hand slightly and pointed down the corridor, at room 14, and said, "That one isn't a room anymore." For 1 second I was too angry to be frightened. David stood at the far end of the corridor looking like death with decent posture, and my first clear thought was not, "Thank God," or "What now?" It was, "I told you to stay downstairs," which in fairness is how most important relationships in my life have gone. Terror first, annoyance immediately after. Margaret got there before I did. What did I say? David looked at her with the patience of a man who had already had a very bad evening and was not accepting further management gracefully. "You said not to become useful to the wrong side again. And yet here you are." "And yet," he said, "room 14 is no longer behaving like a room, so perhaps we can all postpone the scolding until after the architecture stops lying." That was so offensively reasonable I nearly threw something at him. I said, "How do you know?" He lifted his ink-marked hand again. "I can feel the indexing." Silence. Then I said, "I hate every word in that sentence." "Yes," Margaret said, "so do I." David looked tired enough to fold, but he was still standing, which in him usually meant stubbornness had overtaken biology. He nodded toward the far end of the corridor. "Room 12 still reads as a room, wrongly assigned but stable enough. 14 doesn't." Margaret's face had gone very still. "What does it read as?" David swallowed once. "Storage." That word landed badly. Not because it was dramatic, because it was administrative, because it fit. The corridor seemed longer now that he'd said it, not visually, structurally, as if the doors down the hall had become labels rather than entrances. I stepped out of room 12 and shut the door behind me. "Explain." David gave me a look. "I'd love to. Unfortunately, I don't understand it well enough to make it comforting." "Try." He glanced at the doors as though listening to something under the wallpaper. When I was in the house, the records room wasn't just a room. It was a way of arranging things. People, marriages, addresses, deaths, businesses. It filed by function, not by geography. Margaret said, "Yes." David ignored her. Now the hotel is being read the same way. Elise had come back from settling the couple downstairs and stopped dead when she heard that. "No." David looked at her. "Yes." She swore under her breath. "Why my hotel?" Margaret answered. "Because it's full of temporary occupancy, keys, names, payments, room assignments and thresholds. It's practically flirting with the office." Elise stared at her. "I hate you a little." "That's healthy," Margaret said. I looked down the corridor toward room 14. The door stood shut like all the others. Cream paint, brass number, cheap frame. Nothing visibly wrong. That meant nothing. I said, "What's in 14? David's jaw tightened. "I don't know." Margaret said, "Good." He looked at her. "That's good?" "Yes. If you knew too cleanly, I'd be more worried." He gave her a thin look. "Wonderful." Elise joined us, keys clenched in one hand. "So what do we do?" Margaret looked at the four of us as if disappointed by the available options. "We audit." There it was again. That word, not investigation, not rescue. Audit. Cold. Procedural. Meant to discover error, not comfort the people living inside it. I said, "Meaning." "Meaning we establish what the hotel is being turned into before it finishes turning." David said, "And if it's already finished?" Margaret looked at him. "Then we stop calling it a hotel." That was not encouraging. She pointed at Elise's keys. "Which key opens 14? Elise checked the ring. "Master, obviously. Guest key if it's been returned. Why?" "Because I want to know whether the room still accepts hotel authority." That made unpleasant sense. Elise looked at me. I looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the door. No one wanted to be first. Naturally, that made me first. "Fine," I said. "But we do this cleanly." Margaret nodded once. Agreed. I pointed. Elise opens. Margaret watches the line. David says immediately if the room shifts. I go in first. 3 people objected at once. No. I looked at them. Get over it. David said, you are the worst possible person to go in first. Why? Because if this thing is sorting by witness and threshold, you walking in is not neutral. Margaret said, he's right. I hated that. Elise said, then I go. No, David and I said together. That almost would have been funny if the corridor hadn't felt like a filing system with bad intentions. Margaret made the decision. No one crosses immediately. Door first. Observation second. Entry only if the room remains proportionate. I stared at her. Proportionate? Yes. This is why no one likes you. I'm not here to be liked. Fair. We moved down the corridor. Every step toward room 14 felt slightly wrong. Not heavier, not colder. Just more committed than walking should feel. As if the carpet had started taking notes. The lights overhead hummed. Room 10, 12, 14. We stopped. Up close, the door looked ordinary. Too ordinary, perhaps. The brass number polished, the frame square. No sound from inside. Elise slid the guest key into the lock first. It didn't go in. Not jammed. Rejected. She frowned and tried the master. That went in, turned halfway, stopped. David inhaled sharply. What? He looked at the door, not at us. It's counting deeper than the frame, I said. English. He swallowed. The lock thinks the room is further back. No one liked that. Margaret took the key gently from Elise. Step away. She crouched, put one hand flat against the carpet just outside the threshold, and closed her eyes. I said, what are you doing? Checking whether the room still ends where the wall says it does. Can you do that? No, she said, but I can often tell when it doesn't. Useful distinction. After a moment she stood. Well? Margaret looked at the door. No. Elise said, no what? No, it does not end there. Right. Good. Excellent. David rubbed at the ink on his hand again. It's not just storage. Margaret turned to him. What now? His face had gone pale in a different way. Not shock, recognition he didn't want. Overflow. The word sat there. Elise said, overflow what? David looked at the door. People, records, unresolved occupancy, failed transfers, things put somewhere temporary because the proper site is full or unstable. I felt my stomach drop. The house, the hotel, the office moving where it could. I said, you mean it's using the hotel as backup storage? David gave me a tired look. Yes, that. Margaret's expression hardened. Then we open it now before it settles. Elise stared at her. Open the impossible overflow room in my fully booked hotel. Brilliant. Margaret held out her hand. Key. Elise hesitated. Not because she was frightened, because she was a hotel manager and every instinct in her body was screaming that opening the wrong room in a building full of sleeping civilians was how disasters multiplied, which, to be fair, was correct. Then she handed over the key. Margaret turned it. This time the lock gave, not with a click, with a deeper sound. A bolt withdrawing from much further back than the thickness of the door should have allowed. Every hair on my arms lifted. Margaret stepped aside. No one enters. She opened the door. The room beyond was dark. At first I thought it was simply unlit. Then my eyes adjusted. And I realized it wasn't a hotel room at all. No bed, no television, no kettle tray or ugly print or apologetic biscuits. Shelving. Metal shelves running back into the dark. Archive boxes, labelled spines. Paper tied with red tape. A hanging bulb somewhere far deeper in, swinging slightly though no one had touched it. And the smell. Dry paper, dust, old glue, a records office sealed too long. Elise whispered, no. David said very quietly, it's copied the annex. The station locker, and of course it had. Not perfectly, not originally, but enough. Margaret did not move. Do you see names? I leaned slightly, keeping my feet outside the line. At first, no. Then the nearest shelf resolved. Typed labels, Omant/active, Harrow/review, Vale/historical. And lower down, in a box half pulled from the shelf, Thomas/incomplete. Elise made a sound like the air had been punched out of her. I reached for the door frame without meaning to. David caught my wrist. Not hard, just enough. Don't. I looked at him. His face was white. Why? Because it wants witness contact. Margaret glanced at him once, sharply. Useful again. I hated that he was useful. Inside the room, deeper in the dark, something shifted. Not a person moving. A file drawer sliding open, then another, then another. Metal on runners, calm, methodical, a place preparing to be worked in. Elise whispered, "Shut it." Margaret didn't. Not yet. She was reading. There were more labels further in. Eliza/deferred, Eleanor/witness, Elise/threshold. Then, lower and slightly to the right, a fresh tab in cleaner cardstock than the rest. David Harrow/provisional. My throat went dry. David saw it too. His hand tightened on my wrist once, involuntarily, then released. I said, "Provisional what?" No one answered, because no one wanted to guess out loud. Then, from somewhere inside the archive room, a child's voice said, "That one was put in the wrong place." All four of us froze. The voice had not come from behind us. Not from the corridor. From inside room 14. From somewhere between the shelves. Margaret said very quietly, "Do not answer." The child spoke again, not sad, not angry, mildly irritated. "You keep putting husbands where doors should be." Elise shut her eyes. David whispered, "That's him." Margaret said, "Maybe." The hanging bulb deeper in the room swung once more. Its light passed across the back wall, and for a second I saw another shelf behind the first rows, smaller boxes, children's handwriting on one of them, a blue toy car on the floor beneath. Then darkness again. I said before I could stop myself, "Thomas?" Margaret swore. The room answered at once, not with a scream, with a stamp. A heavy office stamp slamming down somewhere in the dark. Once, then again, then again. Approved, approved, approved. The labels on the nearest shelf began to change. Not all of them, just one. David Harrow/provisional became David Harrow/assigned. "Shut it," I said. Margaret slammed the door. The corridor lights blew out. All of them. Darkness dropped over us so fast it felt physical. Elise gasped. Somewhere down the hall, a guest door opened. A man's sleepy voice said, "Hello?" Then a child's voice, much nearer than before, answered from the dark. "This floor is full. Darkness in a corridor is different from darkness in a house. In a house, darkness belongs. It has history, corners, familiarity. You know where the stairs are even when you can't see them. In a hotel corridor, darkness is an administrative failure. It means systems have stopped doing their jobs, which, under the circumstances, felt a bit on the nose. The guest voice came again from somewhere down the hall. "Hello?" Then a door latch clicked. Margaret said sharply, "No one speak unless you know exactly who you're speaking to." Elise hissed, "I run a hotel, Margaret. I can't exactly let guests wander into the apocalypse because we're being polite." I clicked on the torch. The beam cut a hard white line through the dark. Cheap wallpaper, closed doors, brass numbers, carpet runner. And halfway down the corridor, standing outside room 16 in his socks and a t-shirt, was a man in his 60s blinking into the light with the baffled fury of someone whose evening had been interrupted by management incompetence. Alive. Ordinary. Thank God. Then he looked past us further down the corridor and said, "Is that your little boy?" My blood went cold. I swung the torch. At the far end of the corridor, near the fire exit, the child stood again. Blue pajamas, bare feet, head slightly tilted, not looking at us, looking at the room numbers. He lifted one hand and pointed at room 16. "That one's empty," he said. The man frowned. No, it isn't. I'm in it. The child turned his head slowly toward him. No, he said. You're in review. Margaret moved before the sentence had finished. Sir, she said in a voice that would have stopped traffic, go back inside your room and lock the door. The man blinked. What? Now. He looked offended. Reasonable, given the phrasing. Then the child took one step toward him. Not fast, not threatening, just enough. And the man's face changed, not blank. Listening. I saw it happen. The little pause in the body when a person stops orienting to the visible world and starts attending to a second set of instructions. David said, low and urgent, he's being sorted. I hated that I understood him. I moved before I'd decided to. Crossed the corridor in 3 strides, caught the man by the shoulder and shoved him backward through his own doorway. He stumbled, swore, and nearly swung at me on instinct. Fair enough. Inside, I said. What the hell are you? Inside. That did it. Sometimes command works because panic recognizes rank even when it shouldn't. He backed into the room. I slammed the door and turned the lock from the inside with the spare latch, then stepped back into the corridor before he could object further. The child watched me, not angry, interested. That was worse. Margaret said, do not engage. I said, bit late. The child looked at me and said very clearly, you're standing where she stood. The corridor seemed to narrow around the words. I knew without wanting to who he meant. Mum or witness, or both. Elise whispered, Thomas. Margaret swore under her breath. The child's head turned toward Elise at once. There it was. Recognition, not because he was her brother, because the name had been accepted. He looked at her for a long second, then said with mild correction, that isn't where you go. Elise went white. David moved beside me. I hadn't heard him cross the carpet. One moment he was near room 14, the next he was up my shoulder staring down the corridor with the awful concentration of a man reading a document no one else can see. Don't let him place her, he said. Margaret looked at him sharply. What do you mean, place? David didn't blink. He's assigning by position, room, role, relation. If he gets her to move where he wants, the hotel settles around it. Elise said, I'm sorry, what? The child pointed again. Not at a door this time, at the space halfway between rooms 12 and 14, a patch of corridor carpet, nothing more, and said, stand there. Margaret said, no. The child ignored her. Elise, stand there. That was new. Name and instruction together. The sort of thing that feels almost harmless until you remember half this season has been built on the danger of standing in the wrong place. Elise's body leaned, only slightly. But I saw it. The same way I'd seen myself lean toward the house when David's voice had offered coherence. That's the real danger. Not mind control, not spinning heads, not dramatic possession. Suggestion that fits the shape of your instinct. Elise liked being useful. She liked fixing room problems. She liked standing where the problem was and making it behave. Threshold. Of course, the instructions suited her. I grabbed her wrist, harder than I meant to. She blinked as if waking. Ow. Sorry. No, you're not. No, I said. Fair. The child looked at my hand on her wrist, then at me, then said, with sudden and startling clarity, you keep taking the wrong one. Everything in me stopped, not because I understood fully, because I understood enough. The wrong husband, the wrong room. Now the wrong one. Margaret heard it too. I could tell by the way her shoulders tightened. David said very quietly, he thinks the record is still misaligned. I looked at him. You're getting a lot from a child in a corridor. His face didn't change. I'm getting it from the indexing. I hated him a little for that sentence, not personally, structurally. The guest behind room 16 started banging on the door. Open this bloody door! Elise flinched. Great! Then another latch clicked further down the hall. Room 18, a woman's voice. Frank, is that you? Margaret said, too many open points. I said, English. Too many guests waking up. There. Better. The child turned his head toward room 18 before the woman could open it. And in a different voice entirely, older, male, tired, he said, "Don't open that." The latch stopped. The woman behind the door said, "George?" David looked sick. "That's not good." "No," Margaret said, "it's mimicry with access." The child looked back at us. No, not looked. Sorted. That was the only word for it. His gaze moved across us as if checking entries against a list. Then he frowned. Not frighteningly, like a child noticing a mistake in a worksheet. "Too many witnesses," he said. Margaret took the salt packet from her coat. Empty. She looked at it with disgust. "Of course," Elise said. "I've got table salt downstairs." Margaret looked at her as if considering whether she was worth the oxygen. "Yes, from the breakfast room. Wonderful. If we survive the corridor, we'll season the dead." Despite everything, David made a short sound that might have been a laugh. That helped more than it should have. Then room 14 clicked from the inside. All of us turned. The door handle moved once, twice, then stopped. A thin line of light appeared under the door. Not hotel light. Archive light, yellowed, dusty, the sort of bulb that makes paper look older than it is. David went very still. "What?" His voice was low. "It's opening files." The child in the corridor smiled then, not wide, not evil, just pleased that something was proceeding on schedule. I said, "What files?" David didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had gone flatter, as if he were reading from somewhere behind his own eyes. "Occupancy corrections, family cross-reference, deferred transfer, marital error." Elise whispered, "Marital error can get in the sea." Reasonable. The child took another step toward us. The torch beam hit his face properly for the first time. He looked 7. That was the problem. Not uncanny enough to dismiss, not human enough to trust. He said, "You shouldn't have taken him out." David answered before anyone could stop him. He didn't want to stay. The child looked at him. No anger, no grief, just a kind of patient disappointment. "He was already assigned," Margaret snapped. "Do not debate with it." David didn't look away. "He's not an it." The child's expression changed at that, not softened, focused. He looked at David the way a clerk might look at a form that has unexpectedly completed itself. Then he said, "You brought the hand back." Silence. David's ink-marked hand twitched. I felt the room 14 light under the door brighten. Margaret said, "What hand?" The child pointed at David's right hand. "The one that signs." No one spoke. Because there it was. Assignment. Not just to open doors, to sign correction. David looked at his own hand as if it had betrayed him personally. Then at the child. "I'm not signing anything." The child tilted his head. "You already did." That landed like a dropped lift. Elise said no. David looked up sharply. "What?" The child pointed toward room 14. "The box." Margaret swore. I said, "What box?" David's face had gone pale again. In the torchlight, the ink on his hand looked darker. "Not smeared now. Set," he said very quietly. "When I was in the records room, there was a metal file box on the desk." Margaret said, "And?" He didn't answer. I stepped closer. "David." He looked at me. I moved it. The corridor seemed to tilt. Why? I thought it was in the way. Of course he had. Of course, practical, orderly, infuriating, David had moved the one object in a haunted records room because it offended his sense of layout. Margaret shut her eyes briefly. "When you moved it, did it open?" He said nothing. That was answer enough. Elise whispered, "Oh, for God's sake." David looked genuinely ashamed now, which in him was rare enough to be alarming. "There were papers." "What papers?" "I didn't read them." Margaret said, "That was not the question." He swallowed, then said, "A child's death certificate, a marriage certificate, and something stamped return to active file." The child in the corridor nodded once, satisfied. There. Not ghostly, not dramatic. Just a child pleased the adults had finally caught up. Margaret looked at the dark line under room 14, then at David's hand, then at the child, and said, with real disgust, "It isn't trying to complete the correction." I looked at her. "Then what?" She met my eyes. "It's reopening the audit." That was worse, much worse, because correction implies an end. Audit implies process, review, reclassification. No finish, just deeper filing. The child said, almost kindly, "You have to put him back where he belongs." And from inside room 14, something heavy slid across a desk. A pen, set down carefully, waiting. Nobody spoke for a second after that, not because the meaning was unclear, because it was. Too clear. You have to put him back where he belongs. The pen waiting in room 14. David's hand marked as the one that signs. The child in the corridor not pleading, not haunting, not asking to be saved. Reviewing. That was the worst part of Thomas. Or whatever part of Thomas remained usable to the office. He did not feel like a ghost built from grief. He felt like a child who had been made to learn rules before he learned mercy. I said no. The child looked at me, not offended, just noting the objection. Margaret said, "Good, keep saying that." The guest in room 16 started banging again. "Open this door." Then from room 18 the woman's voice rose sharper. "George? Frank? What is going on out there?" Too many waking people, too many doors, too many chances for the hotel to become something it could not easily stop being. Elise looked between the guest doors and room 14 and us, every instinct in her body trying to split into 6 directions at once. "This is getting out of hand." Margaret gave her a cold look. "It was never in hand." Fair. David was still staring at his own right hand. Not dramatically, with disgust, as if it had become an unreliable employee. I said, "Tell me exactly what you moved." He answered without looking up. "A steel file box, grey, about this wide." He held his hands apart slightly. "Latch on the front, label on top." "What label?" He swallowed. Harrow/continuity. Of course, of bloody course. Margaret said, "And when it opened, there were papers inside." "Yes, we've established that. What else?" David shut his eyes once, then said, "A fountain pen." The corridor went still. Even the banging in room 16 seemed to recede for a second. Margaret's face changed. Not surprise, recognition. I said, "What?" She looked at David's hand. "Did you pick it up?" He didn't answer. Elise said, "David." He opened his eyes. Yes. There it was. No drama. No excuse. Just, yes. I laughed once because the alternative was putting my head through the wallpaper. "Of course you did." He looked at me with tired irritation. "It was on top of the death certificate, as opposed to under it, which would have made all this much more reasonable. I didn't know what it was." "No," Margaret said. "You only picked up the active signing instrument in a dead records room because it offended your sense of order." David looked at her. Yes. That honesty nearly made me admire him, which was deeply inconvenient. The child in the corridor took another step toward us. The torch beam caught his feet. Bare, pale, clean, not a real child's feet after running through a hotel corridor. No fluff, no dust, no marks. Filed feet, he said. "The hand goes with the pen." Margaret moved in front of David at once. "No." The child's gaze shifted to her. "You left before completion." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Yes." That was not the answer I expected. The child went on. "You left her to carry witness without room?" I looked at Margaret and she did not look back. Elise said, "What does that mean?" The child answered before Margaret could. "It means she ran." Margaret snapped, "Enough." The corridor lights flickered once, back on for half a second. Off again. In that half second I saw something I wish I hadn't. The child at the end of the hall was not alone. Just behind him, in the brief return of light, stood the outline of another figure. Adult height, female, still, then darkness again. Helen, or Mum, or both. I said, "We're done here." Margaret didn't move. "No, we're nearly out of time." That sentence chilled me more than the dark. Meaning the hotel is about to finish accepting overflow. As if on cue, every room telephone on the floor began to ring. Not one, all of them. A corridor full of shrill, staggered bells behind closed doors. Guests shouted, doors opened, voices rose in confusion. Elise swore at a level that should have cracked plaster. "Right. Brilliant. Fantastic. This is exactly what I needed," Margaret said. No one answers. Elise rounded on her. "I cannot stop 20 people answering hotel phones." "No," Margaret said, "but you can stop the one that matters." She pointed at room 14. The line of archive light under the door had grown brighter. The pen waiting inside, the file box open, the assigned hand. David saw it too. "I think it's calling me." I looked at him. "That is not a sentence I wanted tonight." "No," he said. "Me neither." Then room 14 unlocked itself. A slow, deliberate click. The handle lowered. The door opened 3 inches. Warm archive light spilled into the corridor. And from inside, in a voice that was neither Thomas nor Helen, but something flatter, older, and more exhausted than both, came the words, "Mr. Harrow, sign here." Every phone kept ringing. Guests were opening doors now, heads appearing into the corridor, asking questions, complaining, trying to make sense of the dark. The child at the far end did not move. He simply watched. Reviewing. Elise said, "I'm getting the guests downstairs." Margaret grabbed her arm. "No, if you start moving them now, the hotel will sort by flow." Elise stared at her. "I don't even know what that means anymore." "It means panic is a filing system." That was horrible, also probably true. A guest door opened behind us. A woman in a floral nightdress stepped halfway into the corridor, mobile phone in hand. "Excuse me," she said. "My room phone's going mad and there's no lights," and then she saw the child at the end of the hall. "Oh," she said, softening at once. "Hello, love. Are you lost?" The child turned toward her. Margaret said, "No." Too late. The woman smiled, that automatic adult smile people use on children they assume are safe. "Where's your mum?" The child lifted one hand and pointed, not at a person. At room 14, the woman took one step toward it. David moved before any of us. Fast. Faster than I'd seen him move all night. "No." He caught the woman by the shoulders and turned her bodily back toward her room. "Inside," he said. She blinked at him, startled. "What?" "Inside. Lock the door. Ignore the phone." Something in his tone worked. Authority, perhaps. Or the simple force of a man who looked like he had already seen the end of the evening and disliked it. She nodded and backed into her room. He shut the door on her and turned. The corridor phones were still ringing. The child was still watching. And David was now standing directly in line with room 14. The archive light hit his face. His right hand twitched once. Margaret said, "Step away." He didn't. I said, "David." He looked at me, and I saw it then. Not possession. Pull. The sort of involuntary attention a body gives to a tool it already knows how to use. He said very quietly, "It knows my signature." The room beyond the door answered in that same flat administrative voice. "Confirmed." Margaret crossed the corridor in 2 strides and slapped the inked hand hard enough to make the sound crack. David jerked like a man waking from a drop. "What the hell?" "Stay angry," she said. "It helps." The child frowned, not at Margaret, at David, then said with faint disappointment, "You were easier in the house." That was enough for me. I took the torch, aimed it straight at the child's face and said, "You don't get him." The child did not flinch. Instead, he looked at me with that same awful patient attention and said, "He isn't for you." The words hit harder than they should have, because they were aimed properly, not at romance, Not at history. At function. Husband. Ex-husband. Harrow. Threshold compatible. Assigned hand. Not for you. For the room. For the record. For the correction. Or the audit. I stepped toward him before I could stop myself. Margaret barked, "Nell!" Too late. The child's expression changed. Not pleased. Alert. As if I had finally moved into the correct field of view. And all at once every ringing phone stopped. Dead silence dropped over the corridor. Then, from inside room 14, papers began to turn, one sheet after another, fast, as if a file were being searched at speed. The voice inside said, "Witness present. Reopen cross-reference." The archive light brightened. The corridor walls seemed to shift by a fraction. Not move. Reclassify. Room 16's number flickered and became, just for a second, review. Room 18, deferred. Room 12, witness, then normal again. Guests began shouting from behind doors. Elise said, "No, no, absolutely not." Margaret looked at me with pure fury. "Back." I did. One step, then another. The child watched every inch of it, then smiled, not because he'd won, because the system had. David said, low and urgent, "Margaret." She turned. He was staring at room 14. "What?" "There's another file." "Which one?" His face had gone grey. "Not a family file." The voice inside the room said at the same moment, "Business continuity available." Everything in me went cold. Number. Not the hotel. Not the house, the business. Of course. If the house was unstable and the hotel only overflow, the office would go where continuity was strongest. Names, records, payments, lawful identity, active structure, HVP security shutters, the company, the modern system. David looked at me. "It's moved on," Margaret said. "No, it's branching. Worse. Much worse." Inside room 14, the pages stopped turning. Then the voice read, with perfect clerical calm, "HVP security shutters. Active entity. Viable threshold site. Review scheduled." Elise said, "What does that mean?" I answered before Margaret could. "It means the house was never the end of it." David looked at his marked hand, then at me, then at the open archive door, and said the one thing I had been trying not to think. "It's going to your office next." The child at the end of the corridor tilted his head. Then, in Thomas's voice, but with none of Thomas's age left in it, said, "No, it's going where the witness works." And the fire alarm began to sound.